right, everyone. Welcome to the STOA. Today we have Zoe Curzi with us today with a session called Reality Distortion Fields and Unconscious Mind Dynamics. Zoe is someone I follow on Twitter, and she's sort of in the post-rat or post-rat adjacent spaces. And this year at the STOA, I was thinking I just want to highlight and spotlight people who are doing interesting intellectual philosophical work in odd corners of the internet. And Zoe is definitely doing that. And she had this fire tweet thread on reality distortion fields. And I first heard that phrase in reference to Steve Jobs. And I think it's also referred to Donald Trump too. People who kind of just can manipulate reality and make things happen. And Zoe's using that in a similar but slightly different context here with unconscious mind dynamics. So how today is going to work, I'm going to tag in Zoe in a minute. She's going to present and share her thoughts on the topic, and then we'll pivot to a Q&A open discussion. And if you have questions anytime, just put them in the chat. I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask your question to Zoe. This will be on YouTube, so if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that in the chat and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Zoe, welcome to the STOA.
Thanks, Peter. I feel like an anchor on a newscast. Thank you, Peter. Now for the weather. Cool. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I was excited that Peter was excited by the thread and that so many people were responding to it. And I hope this is valuable for everyone. I hope you'll be forgiving of the presentation format if it's a little messy. It's a very strange topic, so I gave myself permission to let it be as kind of as bizarre and occasionally hard to pin down as I think it actually is, and say what we can say about it and not say more than that. Cool. So I'm going to put up a little PowerPoint and PowerPoint in years. Can you guys all see that? Good. Cool. All right. I'm going to stand because I think better when I stand. So yeah. Yeah, I'm Zoe. Let's see. I'm not going to stand. Who am I? What's my background? How did I come to this? I just kind of want to introduce myself. To all of you, I'm probably mostly like some girl on the internet. Feel free to capitalize all of those letters. I care about this a lot. It's consumed my attention for most of the past couple of years. And the reason is because for some reason, part of my life story was to have my reality seriously, majorly distorted by multiple figures in various ways in my path. So I became kind of obsessed with it as a sense-making necessity, really. What were these experiences? What was this phenomenology? What was going on? How could I integrate this into a world that didn't seem to have language for it? Or all the language that I knew for it seemed imperfect, didn't quite seem to map onto it. I'm probably going to jump around in these slides. There's these other ideas that are kind of nearby and have overlap and don't seem to be quite the same, and have kind of helped me understand, ground in the actual concrete experiences I had. So I kind of threw them out here just to give a sense of what is the space we're in, narcissism, narcissistic behavior, gaslighting, people kind of, that's an obvious case of people kind of throwing you off your own reality and the abuse that can come from it. Codependent relationships. I was interested to notice, and I think it makes sense that falling in love and the kind of extreme infatuation that happens from that was something people commented on in the Twitter thread. Charismatic authority and the whole kind of 90s self-help book thing around charisma and persuasion and persuasive tricks that kind of got big all the way going back to how to win friends and influence people in the 50s. And I think extreme power differential relationships. Also, limerence, cults, high demand groups, magic or phantasms. Some people at the Stoa, I think, recently did a pretty cool documentary trailer thing on that I thought had a lot of overlap with this. So the thing I'm talking about, I think, has overlap with all these things. Like, I think people who have reality distortion fields in the extreme tend to be narcissistic. They tend to also be good at gaslighting, or consciously or unconsciously. At least a sense of dependence tends to emerge from the people who are kind of caught in their field. They tend to be charismatic. I think it's hard to distort other people's reality without being charismatic, whatever that means. It's like a little poorly defined. I think, and again, I'm not defining it purposefully. I'm kind of circling. I think being caught in somebody's reality distortion field can definitely actually create extreme power differentials that wouldn't be there maybe otherwise. Sorry, I'm making a, how do I do this thing so I can see? There we go. Because they're crafting a reality that's convenient to them in some sense. And we're going to talk about like how this is happening, what this has to do with the unconscious. Limerence is a term that I learned recently, actually, which I think I've heard a lot of people be like, how do I know if I'm in someone's reality distortion field or if I'm just projecting onto them in this insane way where I think I'm in love with them or they're going to solve all my problems or whatever, which strikes me as having overlap. And I'm going to talk a bit about something like, how do you know if it's me or them kind of thing? And I think there are some things, some prompts you can give yourself that will help anchor that. A lot of this is going to end up being about how do I ground myself back in reality? That's a lot of the question. The practice or praxis that I think comes out of this is what actually works and what does not work. There are a lot of things that don't work. And I think understanding that this is operating on the unconscious level is one of the first keys to understanding why a bunch of stuff that you normally use in normal circumstances are not going to work here, to loosen up your mental space and bring you back to sovereignty. Yeah, I mean, and persuasion tricks. I think these people tend to know all the persuasion tricks, whether they learned them consciously or just figured them out. This was like a list I found on Google, which, I don't know, I've been watching Ozark recently, and like every conversation the guy has with a drug cartel member, he's like using all of these. It's in the writing of the show. They're kind of known. They're in the water. Yeah. Okay. So what are the mechanics of reality distortion fields? As I understand them, this is my model. I've stolen, begged, borrowed, and invented things. Just trying to understand what the hell's going on here. I think I should briefly note that something about what Peter said about Steve Jobs. I do think that's most people's, just in terms of terminology, I think that's most people's first experience or first association with the term. I think it's a pretty good association. People also do use it with Donald Trump. It since has become popularized. It was Steve Jobs' employee who actually used that term. He lifted it from Star Trek, which I think is really appropriate because there's something about all of this that has a lot to do with magic and science fiction. You're entering a very strange world with all of this. And I actually included like a quote that was just on like Wikipedia about how they were defining what the term was. So I'm going to read it. The reality distortion field was said to be Steve Jobs' ability to convince himself and others around him to believe almost anything with a mix of charm, charisma, bravado, hyperbole, marketing, appeasement, and persistence. It was said to distort his coworkers' sense of proportion and scales of difficulties and to make them believe that whatever impossible task he had at hand was possible. Jobs could also use the reality distortion field to appropriate others' ideas as his own, sometimes proposing an idea back to its originator only a week after dismissing it. So I think that's like a fairly good definition. It just misses the like whole, it sort of doesn't explain anything about how it's actually working, really. And there was a Bill Gates commenting on this saying, I just noticed his language around it. He was like, there was Steve Jobs casting spells and getting people to work overtime, and I was immune because I'm a minor wizard. And you're just like, what the fuck? These are like what is this language that comes up naturally when we're talking about this of magic and spell casting? It's very interesting, and I think it tells us something about what it is. It's hard to describe, and the best language we have takes us into the territory of magic, which I do think is unconscious territory. Okay, so I should say I've read a lot of Jung and Jung influenced people, so I'm kind of operating on the assumption that there is an unconscious mind, that everyone has one, that you could call it the shadow, that it's part of us that we're disidentified from, that we don't have conscious access to at the time. It's defined by the fact that it is something that we cannot or don't believe we can integrate into the conscious world right now. And so we've shuttered it away. And it often takes the form of desires that we don't want to know we have, but definitely have, which is why you get all this stuff about sex and death and parents and all that. So that's like a background assumption I have. You may or may not have it. That's kind of what a lot of what the model is playing with. So I think reality's distortion fields, this is kind of what I said in the tweet, are essentially when somebody makes an offer to you on an unconscious level of something you badly want, but don't know you want, can't admit to yourself that you want. And they are like, I'm going to give this to you. You can have this. I will be the way through which you get this. You know, I am your new God that, you know, and that partly already explains why it puts you in such a vulnerable position, because you can't assess for yourself if this person is the route, if they're full of shit, if they're even capable of fulfilling this promise, because you can't even admit that you want the thing. And you probably have a completely different conscious story for why you're interacting with them. I'm sure it all feels very rational, you know, because we don't want to feel like we're being manipulated for the most part. I think it can also be a threat. Someone brought this up in the thread, and I think it was a really, really good point, is that it's not always an offer. Sometimes they're threatening you on an unconscious kind of implicit level. And that's also happening with some amount of deception. They may be portraying themselves as having power to hurt you in ways that they can't, or having power to hurt you in ways that they can. But either way, it's threatening a part of you that you're not identified with. Like maybe they're saying, I'll take something away from you that you can't even admit that you care about, for example, if you don't X, Y, Z, and then there's a set of conditions, right? So that's why we start to get into why is this bad for people? It's because there's always a set of conditions. I'll give you this if, you know, I won't do this bad thing to you if, right? And so it changes our behavior. Yeah, okay, so that's the basics. I want to comment on like, how is this offer or threat being communicated exactly? If we're talking about the unconscious, it's very like, what do you mean? You're not saying it. I'm operating on the model that essentially there are many, many channels of communication between human beings. Some of them are open to most of us. Some of them are only open to some of us who have put great effort into that or developed in very peculiar ways. From the mind to the emotional body to the nervous system, the somatic body, the energy, the new sphere, whatever you want to call it. So I think there's all these, this is just like my model of reality, basically. There's all these different things. And I think there are very much interactions that can happen on these other levels. Whether or not the person with the reality distortion field is conscious of what they're doing is another question. I'm not sure it matters in some sense. Yeah. So the next thing I'll sort of talk about is like slots, I think is a good concept for this, where some people are immune to certain people's reality distortion fields, right? Like if my parents met some of the people I've met, they'd be like, what a weirdo from California. And they'd be like, whatever. They're like boomers, like they don't care. You know what I mean? It doesn't map into their thing. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. It doesn't even have to be that there's like a cultural mimetic shear or whatever. I think that, you know, we might, it kind of comes back to what is it that you want that maybe is hard for you to admit that you want. Like if you want total sexual surrender and you can't admit that, someone else might want total sexual domination or have nothing really going on in that area, but they want total significance, or they want, you know, to be the most beautiful one, or they want, and this is where it gets strange, is that what we want is not always something that, if we articulated it, even sounds shiny. Like sometimes it's something really dark, like in some way it's actually appealing. We have a slot open for the villain who's actually running everything. Like, why would we have a slot open for that, right? It's not just dreams, it's also nightmares. And I think it's because if you introspect on it, if you have access to that, and I have done a lot of this work, at least in myself, you find there's something appealing about the dark villain who's running everything. It's awfully explanatory, maybe, or it gives you a sense of certainty, or it confirms what you always thought was true, or you know, at least you know where the power is coming from. Like at least it's not confusing or something like that, right? So we can have those kinds of things, and oftentimes it'll be there's like family roles. It's like, okay, this person is mapping onto my father, who is authoritarian and also my only source of love in the world. And so as soon as he maps into that slot, he gets a lot more from me than some guy that I just met would, right? I care a lot more. I'm a lot more attached. And if that's happening in an unconscious way, you don't really know that. So which leads me to my next point, which is you don't know that, but there are signs. So what do reality distortion fields feel like? You can't see them directly. You're dealing with sort of a black hole. How do you know there's a black hole? What's going on around the black hole that tells you something weird going on here? And I will fail to describe all the different possible ways this emerges. I've tried to link up some principles, some commonalities that you see, but every person is different. Every dark wizard has their own game. So I would say one thing before you, like you can, so I should name, there's huge extremes, huge variation in how extreme your experience with someone with a reality distortion field can be. Maybe you meet Donald Trump once, you're like, that was weird, I felt really special, and you go back to your life, nothing really lasts. That was that, you know, or I felt really small or whatever. I think it can go from one weird interaction at a party to basically an entire lifetime of being caught in someone else's thing and maybe serving a role for their ego, and being off, a little off sovereignty. So huge variation. I will say, if you are not already in too deep, in their presence you feel one way, when you leave you feel different. It's especially true if it's just someone you're meeting. Maybe you feel super special or super bad about yourself, or like suddenly things make sense when you're with them, or suddenly you something is possible that's not possible otherwise. And when you're away, you maybe reground or something. You're like, sometimes it's like, sometimes what they're offering, for example, might be like a lack of mundanity or something, like something different, right? And you come back to your life and you're like, oh, my life is mundane and normal again. Maybe I'd like to go back and hang out with that person. Yeah, this is part of the story that you're in shifts dramatically when you encounter them. So your story, it's usually stories about like high importance, psychological high importance things, like who I am, what is possible, what is going on in the world, what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future. If I'm valuable, like what are the big figures out there in the world? Stuff like that is what is getting contacted most of the time, because that stuff, everybody's got a cosmology, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Everybody's got an identity. Everybody's got this stuff. So like I've talked to some people and I've had this experience where it's kind of like, this is more like when you enter like a cult or something like that. And you're like, oh, I just didn't realize. It turns out you can save the world. Like now I know, you know, it feels like you just figured something out. Oh, that's the answer to that. That's why that power thing works that way. And this is what we do about it. Oh, well, that makes the path very clear. Yeah, it can be very surreal, very hyper real. I talked a little bit about the exhilaration, the significance. Things are possible that are usually impossible. I think there's also a version which is doom, dread, inevitability. Things suddenly feel impossible that normally feel possible. I had a very weird experience where I went to a talk with this guy who's he's like a Buddhist guru guy, and sitting there during the talk, and I started to feel like physically bad, and I was like, I don't know, like what's going on. This was years ago, before COVID, so I didn't have that paranoia in my head. When I went back to my house, there was about 3 days when I basically locked myself in my room because I was so disoriented, and I had somehow become convinced through just hearing this guy talk. He was talking about monasteries. He was talking about how we make the world better. He was talking about history and future on the grand scale. And I was like, the monasteries are running everything. They've always had all the power. That's what's going on in the world. They have this spiritual resonance that's doing everything. I don't quite know how. Maybe they can even see me now. It was like crazy, crazy shit. And I was completely convinced of it. And my partner, who also went to the thing, did not have this, but got the flu for 3 days, which I happen to think is not a coincidence. There's a kind of like immune response that I think sometimes kicks in. That had a little bit of the doom, dread, inevitability, like the end is predetermined. Like you're in this story now that isn't quite your own. Yeah, there's a lot of features here. I don't want to get too bogged down in it. Another feature is like it's hard because a lot of these things I figured out via actually going and doing the shadow integration and articulating what was going on there. And when you do that, you see, oh, this is like a really totalistic statement. Like this person is threatening to like own a family member of mine if I don't do this thing. You're like, what does that even mean? But it's in this really weirdly, like it's persuasive to like the child in you, like the unconscious, the larger than life kind of right-brained world that we are also inhabiting. And I do think that bringing it into sort of the left brain, the verbal, the thing you can look at is one way that we free ourselves, actually. Yeah, I kind of like, I don't know, this was something I wrote that I thought was, yeah, once it's articulated directly via introspection, like if you can figure out what it is that you're wanting from them, I can talk a bit about that. Once you say it, you're like, this doesn't really make sense. This is extremely weird. This is like an extremely weird thing. This, and these offers and threats and your agreements with them are existing in the language of the right brain, the childhood world, the gut, the fantasy, phantasm, monsters, absolutism, the world of catastrophe and total salvation, the land of the soma and the nervous system, the world that you build when you're a little kid and your parents represent the entire world, or they represent all of love or conditional love or unconditional love. It's like this very strange space, honestly. And that's because we're talking about countering the unconscious. Okay. I want to pause and just kind of see if I've lost anyone. If there's like any like quick questions just to orient. I'm not sure like where everyone's at inferentially with this topic. So I don't know how to switch back to Zoom, but I don't know. Peter, do you see anything in the chat? Is anyone?
So on my end, this is awesome. I'm digging this. And if anyone has any quick clarification question, maybe just raise your hand or put something in the chat. If not, then we'll continue.
Keep going. Cool. All right. We already talked about this.
Yeah, looks like we're good.
Good, great. Great. Kind of talked about effects a little bit. The effects are basically whatever effect you would have from having your beliefs shifted. Like you act differently when you believe different things. If it's in a highly significant area of your life, like who you are, what's possible, what's true, they could be really big effects. And I do think this is where you get into like cult territory. And I've seen again and again in people leaving cults, this sense of I wasted years. I made decisions, the financial decisions that didn't make any sense. I stayed away from things that I thought would hurt me that won't hurt me, implicit threat thing probably playing out, etc. I do think the basic thing going on is the basic effect. It's more an effect and less a consequence, is a loss of sovereignty, because there's some way that your perception of reality is being hacked, and your perception of reality is very important to sovereignty. You need to be able to see it for yourself. And I will say that I've heard people be like, oh, well, this couldn't happen because I have a very scientific mind and very critical thinker. The group I was in that messed with me the most valued critical thinking and logical thinking and intellectualism more than anything else, right? So that's not how it works. Like, let's be clear about that. I think, and then there are these groups that you hear about, like these religious groups, et cetera, where I think that the leader, I should fill in the inference here. I think the leader of these groups always has a reality distortion field, basically. I'm not sure how you could explain that phenomenon otherwise. Where they're like, oh, it's religious. They encourage me not to trust my thoughts. And that's the classic story. I basically think if anyone's trying to cut you off from any channel of your own perception, that's the channel on which something weird is happening, and they don't want you to pay attention to it. So if they instill suspicion, oh, my thoughts are bad, I should be more Buddhist, my thoughts are all misleading me, or my emotions or my values are bad, they're all irrational, I should fix my mind until everything that I believe is rational, whatever it might be, your sensations, your emotions, your thoughts, whatever. If you're finding yourself suspicious of any one channel, turn that suspicion on them, probably is the thing to do. And then I'll say one more thing about effects. There are people who've been like, I loved working with Steve Jobs. It taught me things about myself I never would have known otherwise, right? Someone's distorting your reality. It doesn't necessarily say which way that's what's happening exactly. Sometimes what they're doing is they're making something seem possible that didn't, and then you rise to the challenge, right? And discover that you were able to do something all along you didn't know you could do, and all you need to do is have someone hack your mind and make you believe you could do it, and then you did it. So there can definitely be some positive effects. I do think the basic thing going even there is a loss of sovereignty, and I do think that in most cases there's a psychological schism going on that you have to embody to live in someone else's reality distortion field. Because tell me if I'm saying too many things at once. The reason I think we always schism is because basically you are a fundamentally intelligent being, and a part of you knows that something's wrong the whole time. A part of you knows, and it might not know in a recognizable way. So some part of you is going along with it, and the unconscious desire that is getting hooked into, where there's this like handshake happening, that's like giving these person these things, giving them ego attention or whatever it is, agreeing to their conditions, changing your life. It's kind of like one part of the whole has gone way out of line and is like pulling your system with you, and the rest of you is still there. Not all of you is hooked in. It's just that one part of you is hooked in, and it's like spreading kind of, it's like taking over your behavior. So I think there's a lot of psychological cleanup to do, depending on how deep in somebody pulls us with these things. For me, it's been an extraordinary amount of psychological cleanup. There's more to do, I'm sure. Okay, how are we on time? Plowing right through. Okay, so I'm saying it's this handshake, which brings up a question of, okay, well then how do I know I should blame them? I'm participating, I'm projecting, I have this slot open. What makes them so nefarious, Yeah, I think when you get into stuff with like falling in love, you get into stuff with codependence, you get into stuff where people at relatively the same power level, it gets murky. You're dealing with co-projections, co-created narratives that kind of go off the rails. That definitely happens. We also definitely know there are the Steve Jobses and the Donald Trumps and the myriad more people that I've encountered that I won't subtweet here, who everybody's kind of like, there's something going on. Like everybody has the same experience with this person. So I say, look for the patterns. Look at their history, look at your history. And look at what other people are saying their experiences with that person and what other people are saying their experiences with you. If everybody is like, yeah, I feel XYZ way around this guy, blah, 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 yeah. Or you can see that they do, and you're feeling that, and you've never felt that with anyone else, the seed of that is probably in that person, right? That's probably more the source of that, because if you're not interacting with them, you're not feeling your side of the agreement. Versus if everybody in your life is being like, saying a certain kind of thing to you, and nobody else is having these kinds of experiences with this person, maybe less so. I would say be careful, because most manipulation, as we've seen with, there's much more talk these days about gaslighting and this kind of stuff. Most manipulation depends on your self-doubt, depends on you turning against yourself. That's really what manipulation is. You have to agree to participate in your own manipulation, whether you're doing that consciously or unconsciously. And manipulators are people who are good at getting you to turn against yourself. So be careful with your willingness to, consider that it might be you. Because if it's not you, they'll use that, honestly. That's what I've seen. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip some of these slides so that we're not here all day. What can you do to protect yourself? So this is a lot of words. I'm just going to talk about it. You'll probably be having conscious reactions to this whole thing, right? If a part of you knows something weird's going on, like I've had the experience of like, oh fuck, like I have to get away, blah, 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 maybe shame, like I'm bad for letting this thing happen, whatever. Again, like basically I think the best thing you can do is preventatively do your own shadow work. Eat your own shadow, just keep working at it, do the best you can. Hope you don't run into a weird high IQ sociopath manipulator along the way. But if you do, you're further along than you would have been. Another slightly different version of this is if you encounter this, and I'll talk about kind of what the steps are, without sliding into like the victim blaming that may come up from those kinds of dynamics, without you blaming yourself for what happened, it is an opportunity for you to do your own shadow work. It's actually a really cool opportunity for you to find out things that you want that you can't admit, or things you're afraid of that you can't admit, and to integrate those and to grow. So that's the most positive outcome that can come from interacting with this. The other thing I'll say is that they are often playing on scarcity and rarity. I am this thing that you can't get anywhere else. Like I am the answer to, you are stuck in XYZ way and have been since you were a child, and you know that, and I can help, right? So like when people are playing with scarcity with you, if they're pulling on that, the best alternative like is to build a beautiful life for yourself. Like own your own desires, right? And encounter your own sense of scarcity. It's more kind of similar to shadow work, but if you know that that's not scarce, you're going to be like, yeah, I don't think so, buddy. Your body's going to know how to do that even. Give yourself those things so that they don't decide the way in which you're going to get those things, because they're probably can't even fulfill that promise anyway. And if they can, it's going to be a very high cost way to get that thing. Trust yourself. You can come up with a better way to get this for yourself, no matter how weird and messed up it may seem to you that you want that thing. Another thing is humility. One of the I had a slide before that I'm not going to get into about what makes it difficult to integrate that this stuff is real. It's hard to integrate. Like this is like a reality shit. Like if you're, we're all born relatively innocent. Like, okay, there are people out there who are very smart, who can act on my unconscious mind, and I may be like not able to prevent this, and it may change all the decisions I make, and it could last for a very long time. Like what the fuck is that? How are you supposed to deal with that? How is a person supposed to live their life? Rejecting it outright, like I'm the one, exceptionalism, I'm the one for whom this could never happen, in my experience, does not help people at all. It actually takes them further from their sovereignty by insisting that this could never happen to them. I think having some humility and knowing that not every person can manipulate you, but for every person out there, there's someone who can manipulate them. And that is not shameful. It's not shameful to be manipulated. It means you operate like most of the population, which is probably a good thing. You're not like a mutant from outer space. You work the same way, so you have the same hacks. Like, and I think taking some time to think about that and take that in, that you're kind of doing the good and beautiful and loving and innocent and trusting positive thing. And if somebody messes with that, you don't have to be ashamed of yourself for falling for that. You're doing the good thing. You're trying to build the good thing and come at things with charitability. Something like that. What they call in the cult space is psychoeducation. It basically just means learn about manipulation. If you encounter it, you'll know what it looks like. Read about cults, read about thought reform. If you don't know this term, it's a great term. Look it up. Robert J. Lifton is an awesome researcher. Hear some other people describe what it feels like to get caught into these kinds of things. Like you guys, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are here right now. So like you're already doing it. I mean, not that I'm a genius at it, but just swim in the water of it a bit. And at least it can induce some amount of paranoia. So, there's that. Keep her out for that, I guess. I've seen that too, but it's a lot of the journey, honestly. And this is the thing I mentioned before of if somebody's trying to get you to turn against one of your own channels, if you get an inkling of that, I don't know about that. Yeah, what I wrote is they can't hack all of your channels because they're being sketchy. And that's just happening somewhere in reality, somewhere in the news sphere, somewhere, the sketchiness is there. What they can do is they can hack, one of your channels and convince you to use that one to ignore the other ones. Right. So that's why, high awareness, meditation, just anything you do to cultivate awareness is pretty going to help with robustness, I think. Yeah, there's caveats, etc. But okay, we're nearly here. Again, jumping around a bit. I'm not like a hard yet like certainty on any of this. I have some initial thoughts about what cultural community practices could help us deal with these problems as a community. One of the things that folks do who have these distorting effects is that, there's an isolating effect. I don't know if this is true for all reality distortion fields or if it's mostly true in cults, but there's certainly a thing in which everyone is suffering and the shared model of what's going on, the narrative does not match what's actually going on in each individual person's experience. But there's like a game theory thing of like, you can't say what's actually going on because it breaks the narrative. And then you're the bad one inside the narrative, even though everyone's actually having that same messed up experience, difficult experience. So coming together, I think, is a really powerful thing. Again, I think reward humility, reward people for being like, yeah, I know I can be manipulated. I'm working, like, I'm just going to keep doing my shadow work and working on it. It doesn't have to be a victim mentality at all. If someone can own, like, that person throws me off. Like, I'm not making decisions from a sovereign place when I'm interacting with them. Even if no one else is saying that, I would trust that you're in tune to something And it can be hard to trust your gut around someone over everyone else thinks they're awesome and actually they're really powerful and cool and they've got all these great ideas or whatever. Yeah, I don't know, common language around this, like for talking about sovereignty. Where's your sovereignty at these days? That as an idea sounds kind of dumb, but there's got to be something here someone can think of rather than how are you? Yeah, and then I think people sometimes permit these manipulators, I'm talking about now more the social thing a little bit. We're dealing with like justice, we're dealing with the ethics, we're dealing with accountability. How do we deal with these people? I don't have all the answers, but I have seen many, many, many wrong answers or pitfalls. I think talking as a community about in detail and concrete detail about what are the consequences of permitting this to continue, what happens to the epistemic commons, what happens if multiple members of a community are losing their agency, what happens when leaders are agreed, maybe certain leaders might be immune and might not really, partly because they're leaders, they're more empowered, they might have less scarcity because they're leaders, they're people in positions of power, they maybe have more abundance, so maybe they're more likely to be immune, which means they might not see that this person is having an effect on others, right? So leaders having their eyes open for that in particular, the inconsistency of effects and using judgment, the best judgment they can around that. And then I think the other reason people don't say no, apart from not really thinking through the consequences, not knowing them, not having good models of them, is that they're uneasy with they're like the cancel culture, ostracism. I don't want to banish this person. It's like a weird, we can't like determine exactly if they're doing something weird. They have a reality distortion field. Is that reason to like kick them out? Like, aren't we getting into witch hunts and paranoia? It's all really valid questions. So I think just knowing that there's a nuanced spectrum of ways to say no to someone. You don't have to cancel them. You don't have to, there's a lot of options. You don't have to think they're a bad person. We all have weird shadow projections and many peoples are navigable. It's pretty rare that you encounter someone who's so well defended and so lost as a person that they are unreachable, that they're affecting people and they're unreachable. I do think those people kind of exist. I personally believe that, not theoretically unreachable, but practically, but I think they're rare. So developing some discernment about that not all reality distortion fields are created equal and the effects are not all equal. Yeah, so I think I want to end there. And there's a bunch I didn't get into because it's been 45 minutes. If you guys, these are some good, it's like a handful of things I threw at the wall, good books and documentaries. Haven't read them all in detail, but I've read most of them, or in some of them I've scoured. Yeah, just some things in the neighborhood. And that's all. I'm gonna call it there.
All right, I'm gonna stop. Yeah, first off, well done. That was an awesome presentation. Everyone give a round of applause to Zoe. I really liked how you brought it to the personal and the kind of the experience of being on the receiving end of a reality distortion, which I think is kind of rare when people talk about it. So I thought that was really well done. So there's a lot of questions in the chat. Feel free to put some questions. 90 minutes in total. You're good for a half hour after the hour, Zoe?
Yeah, I'm good.
So I have some questions for you. So perhaps you and I can have an exchange because I have a lot of thoughts on this, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. So I'm reminded of when Daniel Thornton and Yasna from the Monastic Academy, they came to the Stoa with John Vervaeke, and they were doing this experiment in Toronto, in the Toronto version of the Monastic Academy, and they wanted to develop harmonizing agents. That was the phrase. So it's like someone can walk in a room and then they can co-regulate everyone in the room and then they can engage in kind of like a WeSpace type thing. And I'm like, oh, that's a cool goal. That's a cool goal. And I was thinking there's an opposite to omni-harmonizing agent. It's like a omni-fragmenting agent, someone who can just like walk in a room and just sort of like atomize everyone and kind of make themselves a social nexus. So people kind of like, like basically cluster B sociopathic behavior. And so kind of like if there's a dichotomy there, I was thinking about a dichotomy here, and we were talking in the chat about it. Like if there's a reality distortion field, can there be a reality clarification field? Like can someone develop that talent stack to meet someone and then, have reality a little bit more clear?
Yeah.
And like, I'm curious what your thoughts on that, but something about intuition, and creating the container or holding space in such a way that affords the other person to trust their own intuition rather than distrust it. Because in my kind of research with cults, it seems like the through line between all of them is getting the people to just trust their own intuition and then outsourcing their sense making and choice making and meaning making to the person who is making the person distrust their own intuition. Yeah, so I'll pause there and see if anything comes up for you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, this was something I considered talking a bit about. The phenomenology of interacting with someone who's like, I was phrasing it kind of like a high resonance individual who's like maybe like not sketchy or mostly not sketchy, like people who, yeah, maybe they count as something like I don't know, clarity fields or something like that. I've interacted with some of these people, and my experience is that the phenomenology is very different, and that it's very subtle, it's very gentle. And one of the key distinctions that I made here is that the source of the change is not obscured. So I don't know how to put it. There's something, so I'm trying to articulate like sensations, and it's I think one should still be careful here. I'm still developing my own thoughts here. One thought I do have is that I tend to be suspicious of people who want to create like clarity fields for other people, because my first question is, well, what's your motivation? What's going on for you? Where is this coming from? And my least charitable mind is like, well, what happened for you as a kid that this is the thing that you got to do? Like, why don't you just let people be not clear? Like, and of course there's like, well, I care about their suffering, etc. Right. Obviously. I think something about clarity fields actually has to do with like acceptance of people as they are being like a really necessary starting condition, that the person has like a deep acceptance of that and an okayness with them not affecting this person potentially at all, even if the person's suffering. I think that's got to be a feature of it. I think love is probably got to be a feature of it, but I'm kind of getting outside of my above my pay grade here. I think we're talking, someone who's a meditation person will know more than I do. But I think you want to be careful about like sort of any grand vision for how you're going to like affect people and resolve their suffering. I think tends to have there's a need in it to change something underneath it all. And I think that is often obscured and tends to bias the whole project somewhat in a subtle way. That's been my experience. I do think there are something like clarity fields, and I think those people are often people who don't have a lot of public power for some reason. In my experience, they're like weird people I stumble upon where I'm like, you're wonderful. You are like a wonderful healer. Why aren't you famous? And it's like, they're not. Like they're like somewhere in a farm in Colorado, and you're like, you did the work. I don't know how you learned it. I don't know, like this is incredible. And they're not the people that I'm expecting them to be. They're not the people everybody's talking about for some reason. I've just never actually seen that perfectly map on.
Yeah. And I imagine some ingredients, if there is such a thing as reality clarification fields, would be something like unconditional positive regard, like, Carl Rogers. If anyone wants to watch Carl Rogers in action, watch Gloria 3 Therapists. They have, who's that guy that did Gestalt, that created Gestalt? and then the person who did rational behavioral therapy, Albert Ellis, and then Carl Rogers, they all did a therapeutic session with the same person. And it felt like, like the first guy was running game, the second guy was gaslighting, and then the Carl Rogers was just, doing reality clarification field.
Yeah.
But I'm curious too, because there's like, there's like this, let's say if there's a difference between, or if there is a thing, reality distortion and reality clarification field, I imagine the talent stack is similar. And if one learns how to defend themselves, learn the moves of reality distortion fields, they might gain the capacity themselves to do it. And so it's like, it's almost like, you gain power. And so I have a power to manipulate a field. Am I going to use it to distort it, or am I going to use it to clarify it? So I'm curious if you thought about the ethical component of learning this tech, because it might empower one to do it themselves.
It's a really good question. I don't have a perfect answer. Again, I think it comes back to motivation, values and motivation. I think I remember listening to something with Suzanne Cook-Greuter, integral theory person, adult development person, who was basically being like, people are so obsessed with getting to the later stages where they're like masters of consciousness or whatever. And she, the person who like created this whole theory of these stages of development, was like, I don't really care about that. Like, I care about your values and your virtues, and at whatever stage of development you're at, whether you're a teenager or you're like this, like, mind exploding Buddhist meditator. And that's kind of the perspective that I've come to, where you can get the tools, and that's cool. You got the tools, cool. You can use them for ill, you can use them for good. It might not be the point or something. Like is ended up being how I think about it. Like, at the end of the day, what's your motivation for wanting all of that power? Not to say that it's automatically nefarious, but you should know it. That's your shadow work. That's your responsibility if you're going to go and do it. And you can choose. You can choose. I'm not sure if the skill set is exactly the same, because I will say people with reality distortion fields, there was a slide on this that I didn't get into, which is like, who are these folks? What's their deal? I think like what characterizes them is one thing. And also, what do I like my model of like what's going on psychologically? And I do think that there's usually a pretty severe dearth of love, experiences of love, and a kind of myopic single-mindedness. I think that's why you see them in these high achieving, high status roles so often. It's also that they develop the reality distortion field to get people to do something with them in pursuit of some particular goal that they've decided to hyper optimize. It's kind of like an idol that has become the goal of everything. And maybe they come to get you to believe that that's the goal of everything. And I'm probably going on a tangent here. Let me think for a second with regard to. So there's a way in which that's fundamentally unconscious. And even their like dark wizard skills might be half conscious. And I think the level of awareness in someone who maybe has what you're calling like a clarity field, it's going to be totally different in terms of how much of their shadow they've eaten, and how the spread of their awareness and the direction of their intentionality. Maybe the skills are similar. It has such a different feel. I think I have to spend more time articulating it, honestly.
So the last question I have is about like antidote of it, or ways to protect yourself from like, from my perspective. So one thing is like learning what I call like all these invisible social languages that are at play always, like a status literacy or power literacy, a likability literacy, a seduction literacy, even like an archetype literacy. Like learning not just the object language, but the meta language in kind of like an embodied way. I find, especially the power literacy, like that's what a lot of people are just like really like naive about.
Yeah.
But I think the ultimate antidote is philosophy, like not just theoretical philosophy, but practical philosophy and the capacity to weave between the two. So the philosophy is really embodied. Because I think a lot of moves that people do is they gaslight you. They gaslight your, like, they try to like take over your map of reality and impose their own. But if you're like a truly embedded in the philosophical pursuit, there's sort of like a protection against that. This is why I'm like super supportive of my mentor, Andrew Taggart, who does a philosophical inquiry, and John Vervaeke Dialogos, because it's like anchored in a process that like prevents the people to like take over your mind in a way. So I'm curious what you think about anything I said, but just specifically about philosophy as an antidote towards reality distortion fields.
I suppose it depends what you mean by philosophy. I might not know the answer, but it kind of depends like what process you're describing that you think is the part of it that is maybe an antidote. I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, maybe this is a whole inquiry to go down, but it's like a process of philosophy, like committed to like not only the truth, the correspondence theory of truth, but committed to being truthful with an interlocutor in such a way that allows the spirit of truth through the daemon or your intuition to flow through you. When you have all those three in the game, I feel like it's pretty hard to be manipulated. But yeah, any kind of thoughts there? But there's some juicy questions that we can pivot to as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I'll have to think about that more. I think definitely like an openness to and a value of truth at the minimum as it relates to kind of like my theory of sources I found for robustness. At minimum, it will let you be open to if you are being manipulated, like what it is that's going on with you that is wanting to engage in that and not be afraid of finding out the answer. I think being curious is a very powerful thing.
So we'll have 30 minutes left and we'll pivot to the Q&A. A lot of good questions. And if we don't get to all of them, we might have follow-up sessions. And Zoe, feel free to save the chat at the end as well. We'll tag in our very own Blackbird, Raven Connolly. Raven, do you have a question or a share?
Yeah. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Raven.
Hi. Fantastic presentation. One of my questions for you, and I have many, is about a particular kind of emotional vulnerability that I think many people don't even notice that they have, which is shame. Do you have any thoughts on the connection between shame and the kind of, a vulnerability that people may have to reality distortion fields in their environments?
That is a great question. Yeah, you guys, this is great questions. All right. Yeah, I think what are the dynamics of keeping something repressed is a good question. What are the internal dynamics of keeping something in the unconscious? Shame is a big one. It's the mechanism in many cases, like an automatic switch of I'm not going there. That would not be okay. So I do think grappling with shame is like maybe one of the most fundamental pieces of like shadow integration in a way. Is like sitting there with, I think that's why in my initial thread I was talking about like, what if you just like be embarrassed about the fact that you're being manipulated? Because embarrassment is kind of like shame soft. It's like shame that you can like hold and deal with and be like, I'm embarrassed right now. Like, I hate that this is happening. I don't want to tell anyone, but it's what's happening. You hold it with a little bit of levity, and it's somewhere shame can go, I think, on its way out the door. So yeah, I think they're definitely correlated. I don't know if that answers that.
Yeah, definitely. Peter, can I do a follow-up about that? I think he's saying yes. I don't know. Can't see his face. Okay. I guess so. It seems like there's a developmental process to this, where especially if you're kind of going through, childhood development, going into adolescence, that your parents have a particularly powerful kind of reality distortion capacity over you if you're young, and it just seems like a natural part of human psychology that when we're younger, we have more simplified models of reality, where there's these gravitational centers, our parents being some of them, our siblings, that kind of shape the way in which we conceive of the world, and that coming out of that into adulthood is part of the process of creating and overcoming those simplified models. And shame seems to be part of that. So I'm curious about what you imagine like a community of people who kind of all got into a similar level of development around this stuff might look like. I don't know if that's something you've experienced or I can envision or imagine, just to paint some sort of portrait of like what that might look like.
Yeah. Good question. I've thought about it a bit. I do think I'll say a few things and it's going to be totally incomplete. One piece is just integrating that people are hackable, manipulation exists, there are nefarious actors. You are you can assume you're to some extent susceptible. A community of people who understand this as some of the pieces of the world we're operating in seems important. There has to be a sort of growing out of innocence in that sense, and a squaring with that. This kind of manipulation can verge on like death of the psyche. It can feel like psychological death. And so in that sense, it is a kind of a philosophical, what's your stance? How are you going to choose to consciously grapple with this is a reality of the world that we're operating in and still be loving and trusting? And so discernment obviously starts to come in. You want these highly discerning individuals. I think at least some of the people in a group like that need, my experiences in talking about these things and hearing people's feedback and opening up about my own experiences with it has been that there's like rare gems of people across the internet or whatever who stand out where I'm like, oh, no, you really get it. And you did the work because you had to, because this happened to you. And so part of the truth is that nobody really wants to look at this. And the people who really have looked at it are the people who had to, because they couldn't put their mind back together if they didn't. And I think having a couple of those people in your community is a good idea. And then I think I also pointed to, there's a natural queasiness. I don't know if it's just cultural or if it's a universal human thing. There's a queasiness around not just this existing, but the implications of, well, what do we do? What do we do if somebody's really smart and contributing a lot and also like really fucking with the minds of 50% of the people they interact with? What do we do? Like, there's a discomfort, not just because they're also contributing, but because I think on a deep level, your average decent person does not want to believe that there are people who really need to be banished. And that's the only no that is going to work. And I do think that the no that we give to these people needs to be as nuanced as it can be, as much in proportion to the effect they're having, that we are modeling the effect and we are just simply putting a stop to that and no more. Which might mean the people making the decisions about it are not the people who they hurt directly in some sense, because there's a lot of reactivity. I don't know. So I think there's a maturity in that, in being able to deal with the fact that there are real consequences for this for somebody. And it's either that the people who are getting messed with walk about their lives all messed up without validation, or that this person maybe has to be put out in some kind of way. And those are some initial thoughts. I think it's a really good question, worth modeling more.
Thank you.
Thanks, Raven.
You're Raven. I definitely recommend AJ Bond's work. He's our shame educator here. And his work is all about building a relationality directly with shame. So check out his work. And Jay, you had a question. If you're going to mute yourself and ask her, Zoe.
All right. So I'm wondering, in some of these experiences that you've alluded to, did you ever encounter two individuals with reality distortion fields interacting with one another? If so, what was that like? And if not, do you have any thoughts about what could happen in such a situation?
Yeah, I have seen that. It's a little bit like watching little boys at a playground. It's very competitive. Yeah, I mean, they tend not to get along, I would say. I haven't seen this a ton, right? It's like rare that you meet people who are on this extreme end of the spectrum. I think I've had a weird set of experiences. Yeah, I think they bump against each other and tend to want to operate in different spheres, is what I would say mostly. I think they also, I literally heard words out of people's mind being like wizard battles, like I'm gonna like mind dom this guy, you know, because they knew they like those folks that you know, they knew they were doing weird mental stuff. So yeah, it can get, which I think is, you know, there's something absurd and comical about it, and it's also like outrageously irresponsible because there are actual people around who are actually being affected by this. So it's both at once. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Bliss, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. It was just about the male-female ratio of the disorders that you, in your experience, that you came across.
Yeah, skewed male for sure. I was trying to think if there's any women, like kinda, but not like high-level wizards in my experience. But I'm not, you know, it's a very small sample size, so I don't know. I would imagine there's like a higher proportion of. Yeah, I don't know what the correlates are exactly, like with other kinds of known things where we know the ratio. Like I don't know if we know it for like narcissism or other kinds of behaviors. Yeah, in my experience with mostly men.
Any follow-up question?
No, I mean, that's good. Thanks.
Oh, and maybe a follow-up question for me is what would it be like a female version of reality distortion fields versus a male version? Is there any kind of differences, similarities?
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit spitballing, but so something I didn't talk about much is that I do think seduction is a really good word to use in this space, that we are seduced by people in various ways. And it's not always sexual. It can be, absolutely can be. It's obviously like seduction with the sexual association makes a lot of sense because we have a lot of repressed sexual desires. So it's an area that is ripe for someone to pull on in a very like kind of direct and overt way. Yeah, with regard to gender, the main thoughts I've had about it are less about what it's like to like, I don't know what the differences would be exactly. I know there are women who have them. I mean, you can read about different, I don't know, cult leaders who are women and things like that, where you can infer by the way people are talking about them. I do think since it pulls on the unconscious and we're dealing with like archetypes, or like maybe like Camille Paglia would talk about like sexual personae, like these larger than life characters that maybe we have slots for in our unconscious that reality distorters are acting upon. I think that the archetypes are kind of different for men and women. So like in my experience, I have seen that, and of course I'm like overgeneralizing, etc. Like I've seen a particular figure who had a very strong field of this kind, and there were no, you know, non-binary people in the spaces, so I don't know how that would have changed things. But the men kind of all related to him in you could feel the slot. I used to get really irritated because there were all these jokes about him being like people's dad, and it was like not a joke, you know. It was like there was a real like spiritual father slot that he was filling. And the women, though, it wasn't quite the same thing. It was a different slot. It was a different kind of approval. It didn't have quite the same fatherly flavor. So I think because the unconscious world has all these masculine energies, feminine energies, gendered archetypes, mythical archetypes that have gender qualities, the same person might pull on different things in people of different genders. That seems like very likely to me. I've also had it where I've been immune to someone who like men tend not to be, or men have been immune to someone that women tend not to be. And so I think there are some people, and this makes a lot of sense with the gurus who like have sex scandals and stuff, like who are only kind of interested in attracting people of a particular gender, whether for sexual reasons or otherwise, for their own developmental reasons, whatever. So I think that can happen. It can also be split, not by gender, who people are targeting consciously or unconsciously.
You know, I said something in the chat when you're talking about being whole or complete. I said something like, one needs to be whole in order for someone else not to capitalize on the holes. And then someone privately messaged me with some sex joke. And I'm like, okay. Reality distortion field as some like fucked up mating strategy.
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. That's hence like males being known for it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely think that's mixed in. That's a really good thing to point out. Trying to think if I've ever seen a case where it was not mixed in, actually.
Because like every single cult documentary, there's always sex involved.
There's always some stuff going on, and it's not always, in my experience, it's not always like the sex itself is not always abusive, but as a mating strategy, as a way to attract people. It's a way to get power, you know, and especially in terms of the male way of mating, right? Where you gotta like, it's less about how you look and maybe more about the power of money that you have in a stereotypical way. Like, yeah, if you can get a cult to follow you, you look a lot better to the ladies, maybe, if they don't realize it's a cult, because you've got a whole bunch of people who think you're God. So maybe getting the guys involved is one way to, right? Yeah, a lot of overlap.
Yeah, and pickup artists, they call it the pre-selection or boy band hypothesis, where more women are attracted to one guy. It just has the proclivity as signals that, oh, this man's attractive. So it's like a quick heuristic.
Yeah.
All right, Kevin, you got a question. Kevin, are you still here? Yeah. Kevin, if you're talking, we can't hear you. Maybe I'll just read his question.
Here I am. I'm here. Whoa. Hello, can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. Okay. My question is around, like, the way you present it, it's kind of like a single figure. But I'm wondering how, like mass movements work around, like, maybe a lot of people gathering around the same idea. Like, I'm sure Marxists would accuse Bitcoiners or crypto guys of, like, distorting reality, and I'm sure Bitcoiners would do the opposite. So, like, how do you distinguish between, like, a single person distorting people's reality versus just, like, the collective consciousness being swayed in a particular direction by a big group of people?
Well, I feel like on a gut level that they're quite distinct, but also what was I going to say? I had a thought and it slipped out. A little bit. It depends your like theory of like almost like your theory of history. Like, I don't know if you guys know Sama Boria, his great man, great founder theory of history. If you think that everything gets traced back to certain individuals who have big effects, then if there's a mass movement, you're still looking for the guy behind the curtain kind of thing, or the couple of people behind the curtain. I don't know what I ascribe to there, as opposed to, the kind of like egregores, mass movement, collective unconscious, turning the tide of history thing. That does seem like a complicated question. I think I don't know. Yeah, I think I don't know. I think there's like, that's something I want to think about. There's probably some things I could say with more time, but I don't think I know off the top of my head. I mean, yeah.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, when someone was asking a question in the chat, it made me think of the 4-quadrant political spectrum, the up-down, like off versus lib kind of axis. I think it probably relates to the great man versus kind of collective thing. Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
So, so I think we're going to close the recording portion here. Zoe, do you have any hard stop? I was thinking maybe we can have an unreported dialogue with the group, just to kind of like more informal, and people can turn on their cameras and less of a Q&A energy. Is that something that?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Cool. So is there any closing thoughts that you would like the recording portions of people watching on YouTube would hear?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think I would just say if anything piqued anyone's interest, if people have personal experiences that they're making sense of or intellectual queries about it, anything struck, there's like a lot in this thinking space, and feel free to reach out to me. And that's all.
Awesome. And I'll put Zoe's original tweet thread and Twitter handle on the video description, so you can watch that or check that out if you're watching the video. And I will stop the recording in a moment, but I'll just share some couple events that are related to this, or maybe related. So Tarn, who actually had like a conversation with Raven and Female Rivalry here at the Stoa, put this thing on my radar, bimboism, this mimetic tribe that's happening on TikTok. No thoughts, just vibes. And one of the influencers or whatever they're called, who created it, has come to the Stoa. It's actually quite brilliant. I think it's like, it's this brilliant, this philosophy. It's almost like mimetic protection against being gaslighted by all these other tribes, and just speaking through the language of vibes directly. So that should be fun. And then Chris Kavanaugh from Decoding the Guru podcast. He's coming in to present on the Guruometer. And he kind of like dunks on IDW figures like Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein, calls them secular gurus. And he has this like list that he makes the argument that they're engaging in similar kind of dynamics as we talked about today. So check out those events at thestoa.ca. And that being said, if you feel like you have to go for a bio break or anything like that, go take a quick break, and then we'll be back here having an open conversation.